The heat that July evening was the kind that didn't just sit on your skin, it settled into the walls of houses, into the pavement, into the slow turn of ceiling fans that couldn't do much more than push the warmth from one corner to another. Maple Grove was a quiet street, the kind where people mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and waved at each other without stopping to talk. 3 rows of modest houses, some with flower boxes, some without, the kind of neighborhood where nothing happened, and that was exactly the point. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of his open garage door with a can of soda he'd forgotten to drink, watching the last of the evening light turn the sidewalk a deep gold. Behind him, the house was clean, not the clean of someone who'd had company over, but the clean of someone who'd worked hard to build a routine worth keeping. Dishes drying in the rack, Lily's drawings pinned to the refrigerator with small magnets shaped like fruit. A pair of small sneakers by the front door, laces untied. Lily was 8 years old and asleep by now, which meant Ethan had maybe an hour before the house stopped being quiet. He didn't mind. Quiet was the one thing he'd learned to be grateful for after 3 years of raising her alone. He was thinking about nothing in particular, the garage door spring that needed replacing, whether he had enough coffee for the morning when the sound came. A crash. Sharp and sudden. The kind that breaks concentration. Then another. He looked left. The house next door, number 14, had its front door open, and objects were moving through it at a speed that made no sense at first. A cardboard box, then a duffel bag, then what looked like a folded lamp, its shade still attached, tumbling off the porch steps and landing on its side in the patch of grass. Ethan set down his soda. A man's voice came from inside, muffled, hard, and then the door pushed wider, and a woman stepped out backward. One hand pressed flat against the doorframe, the other reaching towards something inside. The door slammed shut behind her. She stood on the porch for a moment without moving. Ethan recognized her. Olivia Hayes. She'd moved into number 14 about 8 months ago. Quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor who returned your mail if it ended up in her box and nodded hello from her car. He didn't know much about her beyond that. She worked long hours. She had a small potted plant by her front door that had died sometime in April, and she'd replaced it with a different one. Now she stood on the porch of a house that apparently no longer belonged to her, looking at a lamp on the grass, and she didn't make a sound. That was what got him. Not the boxes, not the slammed door. The silence. He crossed the driveway without thinking it through. Hey. He stopped a few feet from her property line. What's happening? She looked at him the way people look at someone who has spoken to them in a language they'd stopped expecting to hear. Then she seemed to reset, straightened slightly, pulled her hand back from where it had been hovering at her side. I'm fine, she said. Sorry for the noise. She wasn't fine. He'd been a father long enough to know what people looked like when they were holding themselves together by a thread. The particular stillness. The too even voice. He changed the locks? Ethan asked. She exhaled. Just barely. He changed the rent, too. 3 days ago. Said he was within his rights. She glanced at the box nearest her. A cardboard flap half open, the corner of a picture frame visible inside. He's within his rights. Ethan looked at the objects scattered across the porch and lawn. A lamp. 2 boxes. A duffel bag. A reusable shopping bag with a bottle of shampoo visible at the top. This was everything she had here. Not a moving truck, not a plan, just what had been thrown out. He thought of Lily asleep inside. He thought of his guest room, which he used for storage, a folding table, some boxes of winter clothes, a bookshelf he'd been meaning to assemble for 2 years. He thought about how bad an idea this was. You can stay at my place tonight, he said. The words came out evenly, without hesitation, which surprised him more than anything. Olivia Hayes looked at him. The streetlight had just flickered on, and in its pale light, her expression was somewhere between exhausted and guarded, the expression of someone who had learned, at some point, that offers from strangers came with conditions attached. That's not funny, she said. I know, he said. I'm not joking. She looked at the lamp, then at the boxes, then back at him, and he could see her calculating something, not whether to trust him, not yet, but whether she had enough dignity left to say no. The sun finished setting while they stood there. She said no. She said it the way people say no, when they mean it clearly, without apology, without leaving a door open. I appreciate it. But I'm fine. I'll call someone. Ethan didn't push. He helped instead. He brought out a tarp from his garage, without asking, and draped it over the boxes, anchoring the corners with the heavy flower pot from his own porch. Olivia watched him do it but didn't stop him, which he took as permission. He didn't make conversation. He didn't try to fill the space between them with words that would have made it worse. When he finished, he went back inside and gave her the number for a hardware store 2 blocks over that had a key-cutting machine, not because it was useful right now, but because it was something concrete to hold on to. She took the piece of paper without looking at it and folded it once and put it in her pocket. She sat down on the porch steps. He should have gone back inside. He stood on his own front walk instead, not hovering, not watching, just present, in the way that sometimes means more than anything said out loud. After a while, she told him without being asked. The landlord, a man named Gerald who owned 4 properties on this side of the county, had sent a message 3 days ago informing her that effective immediately, her rent was increasing by $400 a month. When she'd asked for the legal notice in writing, he'd shown up this evening with a locksmith. I knew something was wrong when he called twice this week, she said. I should have moved sooner. Where were you planning to go? Ethan asked. She was quiet for a moment. I have a coworker in Denton. She said I could stay, but it's 40 minutes out, and I don't. She stopped. Started again. My car's been making a sound. I don't want to drive it that far in this heat. Ethan looked at her car parked at the curb. A silver sedan, older model. A scrape along the rear passenger door. The guest room has a lock, he said, from the inside. She looked up at him. I have an 8-year-old daughter, he continued, who will be awake at 6:30 and will almost certainly knock on your door to show you something she drew. That's probably the biggest threat you'll face. He paused. The room has a window that faces the backyard. It's quiet. Olivia was quiet for a long time. He could hear crickets starting up in the hedge along the fence line. I don't know you, she said finally. You know I've lived next door for 8 months without ever being a problem, he said. That's something. That's a low bar. It's a starting point, he said. She looked at the tarp over her boxes, at the lamp lying in the grass, which neither of them had touched because it felt too much like a symbol of something to move. One night, she said, not looking at him. Just while I figure out the next step. One night, he agreed. He carried the boxes. She carried the duffel bag. Neither of them spoke much. When she crossed the threshold of his house for the first time, she paused just inside the door and looked around at the kitchen visible through the arch, at the fruit magnets on the refrigerator, at the pair of untied sneakers, and something in her expression shifted, not softened, exactly, more like registered. He showed her the guest room. The folding table was still there, pushed against the wall, but he'd swept quickly while she was gathering the last of her things from the porch, and there were clean sheets on the narrow bed that he'd put on in a hurry. The window did face the backyard, just as he'd said. A maple tree pressed close against the glass. Thank you, she said. She said it the way people say it when they mean it but don't want to make a production of it. He nodded and left her to it. He stood in the kitchen for a few minutes afterward, not doing anything in particular, wondering what exactly he had just done. Then he checked the lock on the front door habit, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Something had shifted. He couldn't have named it. He didn't try. She found a room 2 weeks later, a studio apartment in a complex on the east side of town with a 6-month lease and a management office that answered its phone. 2 weeks was longer than one night, but neither of them mentioned the original timeline. Ethan had been working mornings at the auto shop on Clement Road, and Olivia worked remotely, her laptop set up on the folding table in the guest room. The door usually half open, the quiet sound of her typing becoming, over those 2 weeks, a sound the house got used to. Lily noticed her first. This was not surprising. Lily noticed everything. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of blue-gray that turned darker when she was thinking hard. and she used them to study the world with the focused attention of someone twice her age. On the second morning, she appeared in the hallway in her pajamas and looked at the half-open guest room door with great interest. "Is that the lady from next door?" she asked Ethan, who was in the kitchen. "Her name is Olivia," he said. "She's staying for a little while." "Why?" She needed somewhere to stay. Lily considered this. "Does she like waffles?" Ethan opened his mouth. Closed it. "I don't know. I'll ask her," Lily said, and was down the hallway before he could say anything else. He heard the knock. Then the murmur of his daughter's voice. That particular tone she used when she was being deliberately polite, which was its own kind of charm, and then, after a pause, a sound he hadn't heard in this house in a while. Olivia laughing. It was not a large laugh. It was the kind of laugh that happens before a person has decided whether they're allowed to be comfortable yet, quiet, and a little surprised at itself. But it was real, and it moved through the kitchen where Ethan was standing over the waffle iron like something warm coming under a door. Lily appeared back in the kitchen doorway, with the air of someone who has successfully completed a mission. "She does like waffles," she announced. "But she says she doesn't want to be any trouble." "Tell her it's not trouble," Ethan said. "I already told her," Lily said. "She's coming." Olivia appeared a minute later. Hair still slightly sleep-mussed, wearing a gray sweater and an expression of someone who had not expected to find themselves at a neighbor's kitchen table eating breakfast and was not entirely sure how to handle it. She sat where Lily pointed. She accepted the coffee Ethan poured without being asked, because he'd noticed she took it black on the first morning. She ate half a waffle and complimented the syrup, which was the grocery store kind, nothing special. Lily talked enough for all three of them. Over the following days, something settled. Not romantically, it wasn't that. Not yet, but domestically. In the way that happens when people share a space long enough to stop performing their best selves and start just existing. Ethan would come home from the shop and find Olivia helping Lily with a word search puzzle at the kitchen table. Or Olivia would be making herself tea and ask if he wanted any. Small things. The kind of small things that don't mean anything on their own but accumulate, quietly, into something. He noticed the way she was with Lily. Patient. Not in the practiced way of someone trying to seem good with children, but genuinely, the way you are with someone whose company you happen to enjoy. She asked Lily real questions and waited for real answers. She didn't talk down. When Lily showed her one of her drawings, a picture of a house with a big tree and the sun with a face, Olivia studied it seriously for a moment before saying, "I like that the sun looks happy," and Lily had glowed for the rest of the evening. On the night before Olivia moved out, Lily climbed onto the kitchen counter while Ethan was washing dishes and said, without preamble, "She's nice, right?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "I think she should stay longer." Lily said. "She found her own place," he said. "That's good. That's what she needed." Lily seemed to consider this with some skepticism. "You could invite her to dinner. You could go brush your teeth," he said. She hopped down from the counter. But at the doorway she turned back. And in the half-light of the kitchen, her expression was so earnest it almost hurt to look at. "She makes the house warmer," Lily said. Then she disappeared down the hall. Ethan stood at the sink for a moment, with the water running. He did not disagree. He told her about Claire on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after she'd moved into the studio, when she'd come over to return a mixing bowl she'd borrowed, and stayed for the better part of an hour without either of them deciding to make that happen. They were sitting on the back steps. Lily was inside, watching a nature documentary about penguins at a volume that precluded conversation in the house, and the evening was cooler than it had been, a small mercy after 2 weeks of grinding heat. Olivia had mentioned, offhand, that she'd passed by a storage unit place on Henderson, and it had reminded her of the boxes still sitting in Ethan's garage. "I can pick those up any time," she said. "I don't want them cluttering your space." "They're not in the way," he said. "Still." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "It's weird to have your stuff at someone else's place." He thought about that. About what it meant to have your things distributed across spaces that weren't yours anymore. He thought about the weeks after Claire died, when he'd had to move 3 years' worth of their shared life into a house that was suddenly only his. How long some of her things had stayed in their places, Not because he was unable to move them, but because moving them had felt like making a decision he wasn't ready to make. "My wife died," he said. "About 3 years ago." Olivia went still beside him. Not the stiffness of discomfort, more like the particular stillness of someone who is listening with their whole self. "Lily was 5, he continued. "Car accident. Black ice, in February. She was on her way back from her mother's place in Haverfield." He paused. "It was a Tuesday. I remember because Lily had a dentist appointment the next morning, and Claire had reminded me 3 times to not forget." He hadn't told this story in a while. He had told it many times in the first year to the parents at Lily's school, to people at the shop, to anyone who asked, and somewhere around the 18th or 20th telling, the words had started feeling like a recitation, like something learned by rote, and he'd stopped telling it. It didn't feel like a recitation now. Olivia said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. Simply. No additions, no elaborations. He appreciated that more than she probably knew. "I spent a long time trying to make sure Lily didn't feel the absence," he said. "I filled every space I could. Routines, activities, structure. I got good at managing things." "And yourself?" she asked. He looked out at the backyard. The maple tree moved slightly in the evening breeze. "Less good at that," he admitted. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My ex-boyfriend Marcus spent 2 years convincing me that my instincts were wrong." She said it simply, without build-up. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. "If I thought something was off, he had an explanation. If I was upset, he had a reason why I was overreacting. By the time I left, I had stopped trusting my own read on things." "How long did it take to trust it again?" he asked. She considered this. "I'll let you know when I get there." He nodded. They sat on the back steps for a while longer. The Penguin documentary audible through the too. A screen door. The evening cooling around them, neither of them rushing toward anything. It was the kind of conversation that could only happen when you'd already spent enough time in close proximity to have stopped performing, when the edges had worn down enough that something honest could pass through. What he didn't say, and what she didn't say, but what both of them were probably thinking. That they were alike in the specific way of people who'd been changed by things they hadn't chosen and had kept going anyway. That they were both, in their own way, still figuring out what they were allowed to want. He thought about that long after she'd gone home. The house quiet except for Lily's deep. Even breathing down the hall, he thought. I should be careful. He didn't fully mean it. The storm came in on a Saturday, fast and dark. The kind of summer storm that gives you 20 minutes of notice and then means it. By 7 in the evening, the sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind was bending the maple tree against the back window. Lily, who had a complicated relationship with thunder, not quite afraid of it, but not willing to be alone with it either, had migrated from her room to the couch with her blanket and her dog-eared library book. The power went out at 7:23. Ethan knew the time because the microwave clock still read 7:23 when he checked it later. Frozen at the moment, everything went dark. He found the candles in the third drawer and lit 3 of them, setting them on the kitchen counter and the coffee table. Lily looked at the effect with appreciation. It looks like camping, she said, and seemed to decide the storm was now an event rather than a threat. He was halfway through checking that the circuit breaker hadn't tripped when his phone lit up with a text. Hi, sorry to bother you. My power is out too. Is yours? Wondering if it's the whole street. Olivia. He looked at the screen for a moment, then typed back. Whole block at least. Come over if you want. We have candles. The response came quickly. I don't want to intrude. And then, before he could reply, Lily might be scared though. He smiled at his phone, alone in the kitchen. She's fine. She says it looks like camping. A pause. Then, I'll bring the crackers I have. She arrived 10 minutes later with a box of crackers, a jar of peanut butter, and a flashlight she held under her chin when Lily opened the door, casting ghost story shadows across her face. Lily shrieked with delight. Ethan, who had been expecting something more tentative, watched from the kitchen doorway as Olivia stepped inside and immediately crouched down to Lily's level to show her the flashlight trick, and something in his chest did a thing he chose not to examine. They ate crackers with peanut butter by candlelight. Lily produced a board game she'd been campaigning to play for weeks, a complicated adventure game that required reading cards aloud, and Olivia gamely took the role of the wizard while Ethan was assigned, without being consulted, the role of the merchant. The storm moved through in waves. Between waves, there was the particular quiet that big weather leaves in its wake, heavy and close. The whole street gone dark and still. The candles the only light for what felt like miles. At some point, Lily fell asleep mid-turn. The game still spread across the coffee table. Her wizard piece clutched in one hand. Ethan carried her to bed without waking her, which he'd had years of practice doing. And when he came back to the living room, Olivia had put the game pieces carefully into their box without disturbing the board. "She cheated twice," Olivia said quietly. "I let it go." "She always cheats," Ethan said. "She doesn't think of it as cheating. She thinks of it as narrative flexibility." Olivia laughed softly. The candles had burned lower. The storm had moved north, leaving only the occasional distant rumble. They sat across from each other at the coffee table, the way they'd been sitting during the game, and the conversation moved without effort. The way conversations move when something in the air has changed, and neither person wants to be the one to break it. He told her about the early years with Lily. The way he'd learned to do a ponytail from a YouTube tutorial he'd watched 17 times. The week Lily had decided she only wanted to wear dresses, and he'd had to navigate the laundry math. The parent-teacher conference in first grade, where the teacher told him, carefully, that Lily sometimes seemed to be looking after other children's feelings more than her own, and how he'd sat in his car afterward for 15 minutes because he hadn't known whether to be proud or heartbroken. Olivia talked about leaving her hometown in Vermont, a small decision made quickly that turned out to be the biggest thing she'd ever done. About the years she'd spent building something like a life here, and how Marcus had started appearing just when she'd gotten the foundation solid, and how 2 years had passed before she understood what he'd been doing to it. "I'm better at reading people now," she said. "Slower to trust, but better at reading." "What do you read in me?" he asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. It sat in the air between them for a moment. She looked at him across the low candlelight. Looked at him the way she sometimes looked at things she was trying to decide about, serious, unhurried. "Someone who's used to carrying things alone," she said. "Who's gotten good at it. Maybe a little too good." He didn't say anything. The remaining candle on the coffee table guttered and caught. "That's not a criticism," she said. "I know," he said. Outside, the last of the storm passed. A car moved slowly up the wet street, its headlights sweeping across the window. They were still sitting across from each other at the coffee table, in a house full of the kind of quiet that changes something. And neither of them was quite sure what to do with that. "I should go," she said. Not urgently. Carefully. "Yeah," he said. She gathered the crackers and the flashlight. At the door, she paused. "Thank you," she said, "for the invitation. Thank you for the wizard," he said. She smiled. Not the polite smile she'd first brought to his house, but something smaller and more private. Then she stepped out into the wet night, and he stood in the doorway and watched the flashlight beam move down the walk until it disappeared. He was still standing there when the streetlights flickered back on. Lily left the drawing on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. The way she left all her drawings, not presented exactly, but placed where someone would find them, as though the finding was meant to look casual, even when it wasn't. Ethan found it when he came downstairs to start the coffee. He picked it up. 3 figures in a row, drawn with the careful precision Lily brought to things she wanted to get right. The tallest figure on the left was unmistakably him. He recognized the dark crayon marks meant to indicate his hair, the rectangle of his work shirt. The smallest figure in the middle was Lily, recognizable by the yellow hair and the detail of a drawing in her hand. And the third figure, on the right, was a woman with curly dark lines for hair and a blue sweater. At the top of the page, in Lily's determined printing, "My family." He set the drawing down. He poured his coffee. He stood at the window looking at the backyard, at the maple tree moving in the early morning light, and tried to sort through what he was feeling. It was complicated in the way that things you've been trying not to think about become complicated when they appear, drawn in crayon. On your kitchen table. He was afraid. He recognized the feeling because he'd felt its shape before, the particular fear of someone who knows exactly how much a person can lose and how suddenly it can happen. He'd structured his life carefully to minimize exposure to that fear. Routines. A clean house. A clear purpose. He'd been good at it, and now his 8-year-old daughter had drawn them as a family. He talked to Olivia about it that evening, after Lily was in bed. He went next door for the first time since she'd moved into the studio. She'd come to him, mostly, which said something about each of them, and he knocked, and she answered in her reading glasses and looked at him for a moment before stepping back to let him in. He showed her the drawing on his phone. She looked at it for a long time. "Lily is a very clear thinker," she said finally. "She's 8, he said. "She draws what she wants the world to be. Maybe." Olivia set the phone on her kitchen counter, face down. "What's worrying you about it?" "I can't let her form an attachment she'll lose," he said. It came out more directly than he'd intended, and he heard the shape of it once it was in the air, not just about Lily. Olivia was quiet. "I'm not saying he started. You're saying you need to protect her," Olivia said. "I understand that." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but carefully. "I'm not trying to be part of your family, Ethan. I know what I am here." "What are you here?" he asked. She looked at him. In the small apartment, in the lamplight, she looked tired in the way people look when they've been holding something carefully for too long. "A neighbor," she said. "A friend, maybe. Someone who happened to need somewhere to land for 2 weeks. "Lily doesn't see it that way," he said. "Lily is 8, she said, his own words back to him. Quiet. "You're her father. You set the framework for what she understands." The apartment was very still. "I don't want you to disappear," he said. It wasn't what he'd planned to say. He'd planned to say something about maintaining appropriate boundaries, about protecting Lily from confusion, something measured. Instead, that. Olivia looked at him. "I'm not planning on it," she said. They stood in the small kitchen of her studio apartment, on opposite sides of an admission that neither of them knew exactly what to do with, and the night outside was warm and still, and full of all the things they weren't quite ready to say. He went home. He put the drawing on the refrigerator, between the fruit magnets. Marcus showed up on a Wednesday morning. When Ethan happened to be home, the shop had closed early for a burst pipe repair, one of those random Tuesday disruptions that reroute a day, and he was in the driveway, replacing his own car's air filter, when the unfamiliar vehicle slowed at the curb in front of Olivia's building. He didn't know it was Marcus at first. He watched without particular intent. The way you watch unfamiliar cars in your neighborhood, a general ambient awareness. Then Olivia came out of the building's front entrance. She must have been heading to her car, and stopped on the front walk. Ethan couldn't hear what was being said from where he stood, but he read the geometry of it clearly. Olivia's body language, which had been loose and purposeful heading to her car, went carefully still, the kind of still that is its own form of bracing. The man from the car was talking with his hands open, a gesture that looked reasonable, explanatory, but his feet had moved him into her space before he'd gotten past the first sentence. Ethan set down his wrench. He walked across the street. He didn't run. He came at an ordinary pace, a neighbor walking toward a neighbor. And Marcus only noticed him when Ethan was close enough that pretending not to notice would have required deliberate effort. "Hey," Ethan said. To Olivia, not to Marcus, but loud enough that there was no ambiguity about who he was addressing. "Everything okay?" Olivia looked at him with an expression that was relief and something more complicated behind it. "Hi. Yeah, this is Marcus." He was just, "I know who he is," Ethan said, still conversationally. He turned to Marcus then. Not aggressive. Not demonstrative. Just standing. Which, in this context, was its own complete sentence. "She looks like she's got somewhere to be." Marcus studied him for a moment, with the evaluative look of someone deciding what kind of problem this new variable represented. "We're having a conversation," Marcus said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "She can have it with you another time if she wants to. Right now she looks like she's heading out. This is between me and her." "Most things are," Ethan said, "until they're not." It was the kind of standoff that gets settled not by what is said but by who holds their ground without flinching. Ethan didn't move, didn't cross his arms, didn't lean forward, didn't do anything that could be read as escalating. He just stayed where he was, in the way that men who have decided something tend to stay put. Marcus looked at Olivia. Olivia said, "You should go, Marcus." A long pause. Then Marcus got back in his car. Neither of them spoke until the car had turned the corner and the sound of its engine had faded. "You didn't have to do that," Olivia said. "I know," Ethan said. He wasn't going to. She stopped. "Tried again. It doesn't usually get physical. He's more the kind of person who—" "I know that kind," Ethan said quietly. "The kind you can't point to anything specific about, but you come away from every conversation wondering why you feel smaller than when it started." She was very still. "Yeah," she said. "That kind." He didn't say anything more about it. She didn't either. But he noticed, walking back across the street, that his hands were not quite steady, not from fear, but from the particular adrenaline of having cared enough about something to move toward it rather than away. He cared about her. He had been aware of this in a general way for some time, the way you are aware of a change in weather before the sky shows it. But standing on that sidewalk, it had clarified into something specific and undeniable. He cared. And that was going to require him to figure out what to do with that. He pulled back after that, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the subtle withdrawal of a person who has gotten too close to something he doesn't know how to handle and instinctively creates space to think. He was careful about it. The way he was careful about most things. He didn't stop returning her texts. He didn't avoid her in the driveway. He just recalibrated, kept the exchanges functional, friendly but brief. The warmth remained, calibrated to something cooler. Olivia noticed. Of course, she noticed. She was someone who had spent years learning to read the precise texture of other people's emotional weather. She didn't say anything about it, which told him she understood the nature of the withdrawal, and her understanding of it made him feel, obscurely, worse. She pulled back too, in her way. The dinners at his place became less frequent. She stopped mentioning the small details of her day that she'd started, without either of them quite noticing, narrating to him. She was more self-contained. She was building something, a life in the studio, a structure independent of the gravitational pull of the house next door, and he watched it happen from a careful distance, and told himself it was good, that it was right, that two people with the specific histories they carried were better off keeping clear margins. Lily didn't agree. She said, 4 days into this new quieter arrangement, "We haven't seen Olivia in a while." "She's busy," Ethan said. "She didn't used to be busy. People's schedules change." Lily looked at him with the particular look she had, the blue-gray eyes direct and unimpressed, that meant she found this explanation insufficient and was too polite to say so directly. "You could call her," she said. "I could," Ethan agreed. He did not call her. He missed her in a way that surprised him with its specificity. Not a general ache, something more precise. He missed the sound of her at the kitchen table, the particular quality of her attention when she was thinking through something, the way she'd looked across the candlelight during the blackout, serious and unhurried, telling him true things. He drove to the shop. He replaced a set of brake pads on a Honda Civic. He said yes and no, and probably not this week, to various things people asked him. He went home and made dinner, and helped Lily with her reading and put her to bed, and stood in the kitchen afterward in the specific silence of a house that used to feel like enough. The maple tree was visible through the back window. A few of its leaves had started to turn, just barely. The first suggestion of autumn. He thought about what it meant to be too good at carrying things alone. He thought about how the most important things in his life, the only things that had ever really mattered, had arrived the way Olivia had arrived. Suddenly, without a plan, on a hot evening when he hadn't been looking for anything. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. This was new. He'd been a reliable sleeper since the first year after Claire, when he'd learned that sleep deprivation made him a worse father and had therefore decided to sleep. The decision had worked, until it didn't. He lay awake and listened to the neighborhood. Somewhere, a car passed. The maple tree moved. He thought, the fear of losing something is not a reason not to have it. He'd had that thought before. He hadn't been ready for it before. Lily woke up at 2 in the morning on a Friday, with a fever of 103.8 degrees. Ethan knew because he'd checked twice, the first time hoping the thermometer was wrong, the second time accepting that it wasn't. She was hot to the touch, and very still. Which was the wrong kind of still. Not the settled stillness of sleep, but the receded stillness of a sick child who has withdrawn inward. He gave her the fever reducer from the medicine cabinet. Checked her temperature again 20 minutes later. 103.5. Down, barely. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her sleep and did the math on what constituted an emergency and what constituted a difficult night. At 3, her temperature was 103.9. He called the pediatric nurse line. She asked him questions. She said, "If it goes above 104, take her in." He was alone in a house with a child whose fever was moving in the wrong direction. And there was no one to call at thrargorgongotter2goner.com as he had the nurse line. He had the nurse line. He had himself. He almost didn't text Olivia. He did. "I'm sorry for the hour. Lily has a fever that's climbing. I might need to take her to urgent care soon. I know this is a lot to ask." The response came in under 3 minutes. "I'm awake. I'm coming over." She arrived in 8 minutes in her coat over her pajamas, her hair loose, carrying a bag he didn't ask about. She looked at Lily sleeping now, flushed. Her breath a little fast, and she touched her forehead with the back of her hand and said, "Okay, what's the reading?" He showed her the thermometer. She nodded. "Have you given her anything?" 45 minutes ago. "Let's wait another 15 and take it again." She sat on the other side of the bed from him. She didn't crowd, didn't take over. She was just there, in the room, an additional steady presence. The next reading was 103.2. "It's moving the right way," she said. "Yeah," he said. He exhaled. They sat in the low light of Lily's room, the nightlight casting everything a pale blue, and Lily slept between them with her cheek on her hand the way she always did. The fever broke slowly over the next hour. 102.8, 102.1, steadily down, and somewhere in that hour, the immediate fear began to lift, and Ethan became aware of his hands, which had been gripping each other in his lap, and he loosened them. Olivia had a damp cloth. He didn't know when she'd gotten it. She'd slipped out for a moment and returned, and she was laying it gently across Lily's forehead, her movements careful and practiced, and Lily stirred slightly and made a small sound that was not protest. "She's going to be fine," Olivia said quietly. Not reassurance for its own sake. Actual assessment. He looked at her across Lily's sleeping form. In the blue nightlight, with the damp cloth in her hand and her coat still on, and her hair loose around her face, and the absolute steadiness of someone who has shown up completely. He felt something give way in his chest, not break, give way, the way a door gives way when the latch is finally released. "Olivia," he said. She looked up at him. He didn't have the rest of the sentence yet. She seemed to understand this. She didn't rush him. "I've been an idiot," he said finally. "You've been scared," she said. "Same thing, sometimes." She looked at him for a long moment. The nightlight hummed. Lily breathed evenly. The fever had broken. "Yeah," Olivia said. "Sometimes." He reached across Lily carefully, so as not to wake her, and covered Olivia's hand with his. She didn't move away. She turned her hand over and let her fingers close loosely around his. And they stayed like that for a while, in the blue dark, on either side of a sleeping child, and it was the most honest thing that had happened between them. The job offer came from a shop in Portland, a senior position, better pay. A city Ethan had looked at sometimes on days when he thought about what a different version of his life might look like. The call came on a Monday morning. He was given a week to decide. He told Lily that evening, carefully, the way he told her things that required care. She listened with the serious expression she kept for important information. her blue-gray eyes tracking his face. "Would we have to move?" she asked. "That would be part of it," he said. "New city, new school, new start. What about Olivia?" she asked. He'd been waiting for the question. He still didn't have the answer. "Olivia has her own life here," he said. "Her job is here, her apartment. She could come," Lily said. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework still spread in front of her, asking the question that had no good complicated answer. "I don't know," he admitted. Lily considered this. Then, "She makes us happy, Dad." He sat with that after she'd gone to bed. He sat with it for a long time in the kitchen, in the quiet house, under the fruit magnets and the drawing that Lily had made my family, 3 figures in a row, drawn by a child who hadn't yet learned to believe that wanting things was dangerous. He thought about Claire, about the specific terror of loving someone completely and learning what it costs. About the 3 years he'd spent building walls not because he didn't want warmth, but because he understood what warmth meant. How much you could lose when it was gone. He thought about the blackout night, about the drawing, about a woman appearing in 8 minutes at 3 in the morning, with a damp cloth and her coat over her pajamas, and no agenda other than being present. He thought about the way Olivia had said, someone who's used to carrying things alone, who's gotten good at it, maybe a little too good, and how she'd said it not as criticism, but as the kind of careful observation you only offer someone you've been paying attention to. He made a decision. He made it the way he made most decisions, quietly, without fanfare, with some private acknowledgement of what it was going to cost. Then he put on his shoes and went next door. She answered in the reading glasses again, laptop open on the kitchen table. When she saw his face, she took the glasses off. "Come in," she said. He stood in the small kitchen. He'd been in this apartment a handful of times, but he was still struck each time by how she'd made it into a place, a printed photograph on the wall, the particular arrangement of things on the counter, the potted plant on the windowsill, the replacement of the one that had died in April. She built homes out of small, deliberate choices. He'd noticed that about her. "I got a job offer," he said. "In Portland." She was still. "I've been sitting with it all week," he continued, "trying to decide whether to take it. Whether it's the right thing for Lily. Whether it's the right thing." He paused. "I kept thinking about it as a question of what was safe. And," she said, "and I realized I've been making most of the big decisions in my life that way for 3 years," he said. "What's safe? What's contained? What won't cost me anything?" She was looking at him with the careful attention she kept for things that mattered. "You're allowed to do that," she said quietly. "After everything, I know I'm allowed to," he said. "I'm telling you that I don't want to do it anymore." The apartment was very still. Outside, a car passed on the street. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not showing up here to make you responsible for my choices. I'm showing up here because," he stopped, found the sentence, "because I've spent 3 years being careful, and the most alive I've felt in those 3 years was in this building, with you, on the nights when I wasn't being careful at all, and I think that matters." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not easy," she said. "I need time before I trust. I'll second-guess myself. I'll probably pull away when things get close, because that's what I do." "I know," he said. "And Lily drew you into her family picture 2 months ago," he said. "You've been part of this for a while. She just got there before I did." Something moved across Olivia's face. Not quite a smile, something quieter and more private than that. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not a declaration, exactly. A statement of fact, offered carefully. Whatever you decide about Portland, whatever happens, I'm not planning to disappear. I told you that." "I know," he said. "But I needed to tell you that I don't want to protect myself from you anymore. Because that's what I've been doing. And it's..." He exhaled. "It's exhausting, and it's also just wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the small kitchen and stood in front of him, close, and looked at him in the direct, unhurried way she had. "I'm also tired," she said, "of deciding in advance that things won't work." He reached out and touched the side of her face. gently, asking, and she leaned into it by the smallest amount, the kind of motion that contains a whole decision. They stood in the kitchen for a while, not saying much. Outside, the street was quiet. The summer finally beginning to release its grip on the air, a coolness at the edge of the warm night that suggested autumn coming, a change in season so gradual you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. He did not take the job in Portland. He told himself this was not because of Olivia, and partly that was true. Lily's school was here, the shop was here, the street with the maple tree, and the fruit magnets, and the neighbor who'd replaced her dead plant in April. But partly it was because of her, and he was done pretending otherwise. He told Lily the next morning that they were staying. Lily looked at him over her cereal. "Good," she said. "That's all you've got?" he asked. "I already knew," she said, and went back to her cereal. He stared at his 8-year-old daughter for a long moment. "How did you know?" She shrugged, with the serenity of someone for whom this was not a surprise. "Because you looked at her the same way you look at me," she said. "Like you'd do anything." He didn't have a response to that. He poured his coffee. Lily finished her cereal. She put the bowl in the sink, the way he'd taught her. Then she turned back and looked at him with the blue-gray eyes that were her mother's, and also entirely her own. "Can Olivia come for dinner Friday?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I'll ask her." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to get her backpack. He asked. She came. It was not a grand occasion. Ethan made pasta the kind he knew Lily would eat without complaint, with the specific ratio of butter to garlic that had been refined over years, and Olivia brought bread from the bakery 2 streets over, and something had changed in the way the 3 of them moved around each other in the kitchen, a subtle unlocking, a ease that had been there in potential since the beginning and was now simply allowed to be. Lily talked. Lily always talked. She told them about her friend from school who had a hamster named Professor, and about the book she was reading, and about how she'd learned that octopuses have 3 hearts, which she found personally significant for reasons she was still working out. Olivia listened. Ethan watched Olivia listen. Later, after Lily was in bed and the dishes were done, they sat on the back steps with the remains of the bread and 2 glasses of water, not wine, just water, which was somehow right, and the backyard was quiet around them, the maple tree dropping a few early leaves onto the grass below. "She told me once that the house felt warmer when you were here," Ethan said. "Lily." Olivia looked at him. She was right. Olivia looked at the maple tree. "At the leaves, beginning to fall. I'm going to keep messing up," she said, getting in my head, pulling back. "I know," he said. "I'll probably get too quiet when I should talk. It's a problem I have. I've noticed," she said. "We can figure it out," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. In the dark of the backyard, in the last of summer, giving way to the first suggestion of something new, she looked at him the way she looked at things she had decided were real. "Okay," she said. Not a sweeping declaration. Not a promise that covered everything. Just that single word, chosen carefully, offered honestly the smallest possible beginning of something they were both, for the first time in a long time, willing to try. The maple leaves fell quietly in the dark. The house was warm.